Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Ready, Check, Go, Starting Your Zero Trust Journey. I'm Alifiya Sadikali. I'm a senior PMM here at Trend Micro, and I'll be your host today for this discussion. Before we jump into it, there's just a few housekeeping items that I'd like to cover. Firstly, you'll notice that your microphones are muted to minimize any background noise to ensure a smooth and enjoyable experience for everyone. Secondly, we have a dedicated Q&A at the end where we'll address all your queries. Feel free to use the Q&A tab to populate questions or your insights as well. And lastly, recording of this webinar will be made available to you as well as other Zero Trust resources. So stay tuned on receiving that communication from us later. Now I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our guest today, John Grady. John is a principal analyst at the Enterprise Strategy Group, ESG, and brings a wealth of experience and knowledge to this discussion. For some context, John and the ESG team conducted a survey with over 379 IT and security professionals like yourselves on Zero Trust at the tail end of last year, and we'll be sharing those insights with us today. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. All right, so I think we've skipped ahead. There we go. Sorry about that. John, Zero Trust has continued to grow in prominence over the last few years. Can you give us a backdrop of how organizations are thinking about Zero Trust today?
Absolutely. So, we've been tracking this market for quite a while, and we've seen definitely a kind of a change in perceptions in a positive way over the last few years. So, one of the things we track is kind of how organizations and IT professionals think about zero trust overall. And so, we've asked this question multiple times, and the answer options are kind of wordy, but what this nets out to is to folks kind of view zero trust as a strategy or as kind of tools and technology. You can see the top definition is focused on strategy, and the bottom two are more focused on tools and technology. And we asked this two different ways: kind of select all that you agree with, and then which one is most aligned with yours and your organization's view. And there's no real right or wrong answer, but we do obviously put zero trust more in a strategic kind of framework. And we've seen more and more organizations taking that point of view over time. So you can see just around 2/3 of respondents to our study agreed with the statement that zero trust is a strategy. In the past, it's been over half that pointed more to tools and technology. So glass half full, we're moving in the right direction and getting more agreement. Glass half empty, there's still about 1/3 of organizations that are viewing this as tools and technologies. And we do need a bit more education in that regard. So the other kind of overarching aspect that we track is why are organizations interested in zero trust? What are the problems they're trying to solve? What are the drivers pushing them towards this initiative? And you can see a fairly long list here, and you can see they're kind of categorized as strategic and tactical. And we've seen a shift over time from this more narrow focus around zero trust as really a security initiative and really having a goal of preventing breaches and reducing incidents, which is still incredibly important, not to downplay that. You can see those kind of listed as tactical drivers for zero trust. But more and more organizations are looking at this through the strategic lens, and especially with an eye towards modernization. And that comes out in a couple different aspects here. So the top response was modernizing the cybersecurity program. The idea there is, the rest of the IT environment is fundamentally changing, and traditional security approaches really can't scale to meet the needs of modern enterprise architectures. When we think about, traditionally users and resources being in a single location, that idea of kind of, you know, broadly defined trust boundaries made somewhat more sense. It still wasn't a great way to go about things, but it was, arguably kind of doable. But now when you have employees and resources spread across, clouds, multiple locations, you can't do that. And so zero trust is an avenue towards catching security up to the rest of the IT environment. And then towards the bottom, about a third of organizations pointed to cloud adoption and digital transformation as well. So really direct correlation between how zero trust can support those types of initiatives.
So, John, when I look at this, the tactical and strategic drivers, to achieve some of these goals, we're seeing more and more conversations with customers who want to lean into a platform-centric approach that allows them to integrate some of these proactive measures alongside the reactive strategies, and looking at it from a zero trust lens, a platform can enable quite a few of these outcomes for them. As many security vendors, including Trend Micro, are already there in terms of creating that platform approach to enable zero trust strategies, but there's still challenges. Can you talk to us a little bit about the challenges that are involved in implementations?
Yeah, absolutely. So really, there's a mix here, and I didn't diagram this out on the slide, but as you would expect, issues with zero trust cut across, people, process, and technology. And I think we've repeatedly found that among the biggest issues, and I think we'll touch on this a bit later, is organizational challenges. So at the top of the list here, aligning teams across different groups. Zero trust is so broad. Just within security, you're bringing different teams together, to say nothing of different groups within IT, and then the business as well becomes really important to get business stakeholders involved. We'll see that again later as well. Talked a lot about the fact that zero trust should be considered a strategy, but ultimately you do need tools in place to kind of operationalize those policies and enforce the rules that you're putting in place. And in a lot of cases, that requires new technologies. Not all. You can certainly kind of repurpose, certain aspects of the security stack, but it can be difficult to determine exactly what you need to use, get them deployed and working correctly. A couple other things here: staff and skills. We as at ESG especially talk about the cybersecurity skills shortage quite a bit, and that comes through with zero trust as well. And then user experience, right? At the end of the day, security has to protect the business and the organization, but it has to do so without impeding innovation, user productivity, and so on. And that can be a balance. And so we see that as a core challenge as well. And then there's the lucky 3% at the bottom who say they haven't experienced any challenges with zero trust. We tried to do in-depth interviews with that group, but we couldn't. But just about across the board, there are going to be some speed bumps along the way, but we'll see later when we get to benefits. It's really important to keep moving forward, because at the end of the day, the benefits do outweigh the challenges and obstacles you have to overcome.
So speaking of challenges, I think, we wanted to, I know it's crucial to acknowledge the challenges inherent in zero trust projects. And I thought it'd be enlightening to tap into the experience of our audience today. Specifically, we're curious if any of our attendees today have embarked on a zero trust project, only to pause it later. So we're gonna do a small poll for you guys, a survey to click on and tell us a little bit about what your experience has been. And the survey should be popping up on your screen just about now. Are we seeing the survey? Not yet. Okay. Let's see. Are you seeing the survey now? Okay, so it was available at the beginning and it's not available right now. Oh, there it is. Okay. Okay. So we're just looking at the results here from the survey. 58% of us saying that yes, they've paused or abandoned a zero trust project. And organizational issues implementing the project. Okay, fantastic. Let's see how this aligns with what John and his team found at ESG.
Pretty similar results. I think the folks here viewing the webinar were maybe even a little more likely to say they had paused or abandoned zero trust projects, and some of the reasons why were a little different. But among our respondent base, just over a third said that they had paused or abandoned a project in the past. That was down a little bit from previous iterations of this study, but the point being, and I think it was borne out in the online polling here. It's very common. It can be a complex undertaking, and when we get to best practice, we'll talk about maybe some of the ways that can be the risk of that can be reduced or alleviated. But there's a few reasons why. Among our group, it was organizational issues. So again, that was a top challenge overall. Was kind of concerns about aligning folks, and then among those who said they had to pause or abandon, nearly half said it was organizational issues. Be that from a strategy perspective, implementation, or so on. I saw technical issues was the most common response given among our webinar viewers, and that was, you can see in the middle of the list here. So again, just a few percentage points behind, very, very common as well. So again, you have to set the strategy, but then you have to actually implement it via technology. And so that's a common theme. And then not seeing enough initial benefits. This, in my opinion, this initiative is in a lot of ways about momentum, right? So it's picking out and this maybe dovetails into best practices, but picking out the use case that's going to be most impactful to your organization, but also one that's achievable, right? Not necessarily biting off more than you can chew at the beginning, because you need to, show results to the broader organization to get buy-in and kind of keep things moving forward. And so you can see among those who said they had paused or abandoned, some maybe didn't do that, and had to kind of reset and start over.
Yeah, and that's so important, right? One of the most common questions we get from customers is, where do I even start? So when there is false starts, were they even starting in the right place to begin with, right? So one of the big things for us is helping customers determine what that right place for them could be. So John, do you have some recommendations and requirements when it comes to zero trust? What are some of the key things that organizations should be considering?
Yeah, so I referenced best practices, and a few things were borne out in the research here. So we asked those who had already started or maybe gone pretty far down the path of a zero trust initiative, in their opinion, what some of the most successful factors were in the implementation. And at the top of the list, I think really having that higher level strategic vision. So having executive support, and again, outside of just IT and security, I mean, that's critical, obviously, but you have to get buy-in from the business, especially now that IT is so democratized and they have kind of a say in deploying cloud applications and things of that sort. You have to get buy-in across the business more broadly, and then having a clear multi-year plan and kind of staying the course. And I think there's a mix there, because there's a couple of other answers here in terms of remaining flexible and adjusting and starting small and expanding over time. And it's kind of a mix of that. I think it's really important to have a vision of where you want to go, but not necessarily starting, too large. So we'll kind of look at some of the different pillars within Zero Trust, and it's not necessarily practical or recommended to, try to address all right off the bat. But I do think it's important to understand, as you maybe pick and choose the use case and the areas that you want to focus on, where you want to go down the line, so that, as you're building out your organizational strategy and choosing the technologies to support the initiative, you're not kind of myopically focused on the short term, because I think that can, if we saw technical issues come up, that can lead to some of those false starts, having to kind of redo things, maybe reassess your technology choices, and things of that sort. And again, technology, as much as we say it's a strategy and it's true, it's really important to choose the right vendors, for a variety of reasons, and we'll see. One of those is the ability to kind of act as a trusted advisor and help you navigate the journey, as you work through it. Service providers as well, from a planning and implementation perspective, those that have the resources to engage with service providers that can yield benefits. Obviously, they have visibility into a lot of different environments and customer success stories, so that can be beneficial as well.
Right, and I think, John, when we talk about executive support of IT, it's so important. I know that at Trend, we met with CISOs around the world to, collect feedback on what it is that's important to them to create the executive dashboards we have and the reporting we have, because we wanted to ensure that it enabled these executives to speak to their boards, to get the support needed to implement some of these programs, so that the objectives were really clear on what the risks were and how they were going to go about tackling and building a zero trust program around that. So I think those two definitely feature highly when we speak to customers as well.
Yeah, and I mean that's, I think, an overall trend we see within cybersecurity is connecting security, and speaking about it in a business sense to maybe non-security folks, the board specifically. So it's an important theme overall, but especially as it comes to zero trust, because it is so strategic. So that's a great point. So we talked about starting points. This probably appears as a bit of a busy slide, but when we look at some of the reference architectures that are out there in the market, the kind of common agreement is, viewing zero trust with regards to these, 5 pillars: networks, data, devices, users and identity, and apps and workloads. And so we asked this question 2 ways: where did you begin your zero trust journey? And then, kind of knowing what you know now, where would you, if you were starting over? So where did you is the dark blue bar, and where would you start if you were starting over is the light blue bar. And again, just as a visual, you can kind of derive a couple quick takeaways from this. Not a lot of consensus. The call out says that as well, obviously. Fairly even split among the different pillars here. And with the exception of devices, not necessarily a lot of folks who said, well, we started here and definitely wouldn't do that again. We'd go somewhere else. And that's kind of behind the data as well. There wasn't a lot of kind of, necessarily switching from one category to another, again, with the exception of devices. So I think the takeaway here, one of the takeaways is, again, there's not necessarily a quote unquote right answer. It's really about assessing the use cases that are most critical to your organization, where you think you can generate the most momentum, possibly looking at, from a tool perspective, what's already in your environment and what can help you address those use cases and start to apply zero trust tenets, and then going from there. So, all of these areas have applicability to zero trust. So, unfortunately, there's no kind of, secret or magic bullet, but it comes down to, what's most important to you.
And I think when I look at this, no matter where you start or what the starting point is in every organization, it'll be different. But I think having a good user behavior analytics, right, where the intelligence and the information from all of these has to be in the same place across these layers, to have those policy decision and enforcement points, to have a full zero trust stance. So, I think something to consider in that sense as well is to have that analytic side of it figured out as well, right, John?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that is there's a couple areas that are, kind of important throughout, regardless of what area that you're focused on. And analytics is really critical, and risk as well. And that dovetails into the next aspect here, which is, understanding, how often organizations are assessing risk, for kind of each and every transaction. Um, uh, the data was actually, again, from a glasses half full perspective, most organizations are considering risk when they're applying policy decisions. But it could be done more, and it could be done in a more automated fashion. So on the left side, you can see, only 13% say they're not doing that, which kind of begs the question: how are they applying zero trust? But less than a third say that they're assessing risk in real time and doing it continually and in a dynamic way, kind of fully contextual policy architectures and so on. So there's well over half in the middle that are maybe doing it sometimes in some areas. So there's some work to do. And on the right, you can see the areas that they are assessing with regards to risk. Overall, the average was 2.3 of these areas. So most are looking at kind of multiple areas, but really all of these are important. So we hear a lot about device kind of posture, which is towards the bottom of the list, but the data being accessed, I think it was kind of refreshing to see that figured so prominently, because at the end of the day, that's really what users are accessing. It's less the application and more the data behind it that's critically important. The application as well, but even external factors like the threat landscape, and we'll see that in some of the architecture slides that we pull in a few moments. But that goes underappreciated sometimes. I think we're focused a lot on the internal, making sure kind of the users and the resources they're accessing, kind of there's authorization and makes sense, but understanding what the threat landscape looks like relative to your environment is really important as well. And then Alifiya mentioned, behavioral analytics and towards the bottom, but still 43%. It's a strong percentage of organizations that reference that. So, this is really foundational to zero trust. But especially if you don't have the right tools in place, it can be complex to implement. So I think this is a really key area to focus in on and think about as you start to expand a zero trust strategy. You need to be doing this. So what's the most efficient way to bring all these different piece parts to bear?
And from a risk assessment perspective, I think it's also crucial to consider the quality of the risk assessment and the dynamicness that you mentioned, John. And, is it real time or is it point of time assessments, right? So when we use, for us, when we talk about assessments, we want to ensure that we kind of align with standard risk management methodologies based on NIST 830 and 860, starting off with the likelihood of risk versus the impact of that risk. And once on the left, we have things that go into calculating that likelihood, like vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, security policies, threat detection, and attack attempts, and multiplying that with the criticality of the asset. So when considering risk assessments, assessing risk in the environment, you want assessments to go beyond just vulnerability scans to account for security controls and configuration, threat activity, as well as exposure, in order to make those really good policy decisions that come with it. So I think we at Trend kind of hang our hat on really great assessments, which take into consideration many, many factors, as well as them being continuous and dynamic. And so just wanted to kind of showcase this a little bit. John, what's your take on the quality of assessments when organizations should be considering how they assess their risk?
Yeah, well, I think one of the words you use, kind of the criticality is really important, right? It's really difficult to, at scale, apply a certain level of granularity everywhere. So you do have to understand, you know, how important certain assets are, how the relationship to the data they may have access to, the vulnerabilities that may be you know in place on that device or entity, and kind of bring all those aspects together. So I think this diagram does a really good job kind of laying out all the different considerations and inputs that you need to assess for when it comes to risk. So, again, when it comes back to technology, I think it's important to understand some of the key capabilities that are important for supporting zero trust. Again, a bit of a longer list here, but at the top of it, unsurprising based on a lot of the focus we've seen over the last year or so, AI ML, and that takes different forms, right? And it's important from a threat analytics perspective, and I think from a vendor perspective, uh, the industry's been kind of working in that direction for quite a while. But now we're seeing AI applied more to things like risk assessment, policy recommendations, improving automation with a better degree of confidence. There's a lot of applications. One of the big changes with zero trust again is moving to less of a static and more of a dynamic approach, and that can be pretty difficult to scale, in a manual fashion. So there's certainly areas where AI can be a force multiplier and help achieve some of those goals. The other piece is consistency. So zero trust, again, really seeks to move away from that idea of kind of location-based implicit trust, and so as environments have become more distributed, it's really important to have consistent policy application across all aspects of the environment. So we've seen that repeatedly kind of put towards the top of lists like this. And the other piece is really this idea of platforms, something else we've seen more broadly discussed across the industry. And I think it's important to note there's two pieces of this. And I think the first caveat is there's no vendor that can provide a platform that addresses every aspect of zero trust. And if they tell you that, they're probably fibbing. But there's value and examples that address multiple components of zero trust, and I think that helps from a deployment and implementation perspective. Operational efficiency. Over time, having commonality from a technology platform. If you can reduce the number of vendors and independent tools that you're working with, there's value in that. And so, starting with a platform, but one that also takes in kind of ecosystem integrations with vendor partners, right? And I think one of the biggest examples of this, but not the only, is identity, because there's a lot of kind of still silos between true kind of cybersecurity vendors and identity is core to zero trust. So cyber vendors that have strong partnerships with identity providers is the first piece, but vendors that maybe don't have the network component and have partnerships or aspects of the network component with zero trust and have vendor partnerships there. All those areas can really help move the needle. You mentioned risk assessment and then automation as well. So, a lot of things here, but I think, again, this pretty closely ties back to some of the challenges and priorities that we've seen elsewhere. So, again, another example of kind of the data tying together between the issues organizations are kind of facing, where they want to go with zero trust, and then what they expect from tools to support the strategy.
There's so much information out there around zero trust. Are there any switching gears a little bit, are there any sources you see organizations turning to more, John, to get advice or to, really wrap themselves in the best practices before starting on this journey or even while they're on this journey?
Yeah, I think the federal government, we've seen a lot of emphasis over the last couple years on zero trust, maybe probably not starting with, but certainly highlighted by the initial Biden administration executive order, which went broader than zero trust, but zero trust was a core component of it. But you see highlighted in red here, NIST and CISA have been working on reports and maturity models, reference architectures for the last few years. And in the aggregate, 85% of our respondents pointed to one of those two federal sources. So, you know, in some ways can be more focused on federal agencies, but do a really good job kind of laying out the broader zero trust architecture. We've seen a lot of vendors kind of map to these as well as a point of reference. And so I think that's an important point, right? We do see commonality between how users are thinking about this and vendors, and it serves a good purpose. But highlighted in blue, is are resources from vendors, really two different flavors. So advice that vendors are providing more on a one-to-one basis as part of the sales cycle, and then reference architectures and maturity models that they're making available as well. So, I mentioned the point earlier about service providers and how they can help. The reality is not every organization, end user organization, has the resources to engage. And so as you're looking for vendors to work with from a technology perspective, those that can kind of roll up their sleeves and help you provide some best practices, have a broader view of zero trust outside of just what they supply, and address, I think is important as you kind of build out a strategy. We have seen some vendors that are really focused on what they do, and if you have a good plan in place, that can be fine. But especially as you're trying to pull the pieces together and develop that longer term vision and roadmap, I think the vendors that can kind of help you, again, as a trusted advisor, can really move the needle. So I mentioned NIST, and I'm not sure how many folks have kind of looked into this framework and this document. So this was originally released in 2020, and there's really two goals when it comes to zero trust in the NIST model. So preventing unauthorized access to data and services, and then making access control and those decisions as granular as possible. And that's really done, in the center here through these policy enforcement points and policy decision points. I do think that this diagram, and it's worked out well in the text of the document. You have kind of the subject and the system trying to access this enterprise resource, and you have the policy enforcement point in the middle. The way this is kind of constructed can be misconstrued as kind of broad, kind of trusted aspects of the environment, and the diagram itself, this is directly from the NIST document, doesn't lay out that's supposed to be as granular as possible, one-to-one if possible, to kind of, again, change the dynamic. And then we're pulling in all this different telemetry to understand, again, context and whether access should be allowed or not. So things like PKI for device validation, data access, and understanding what's actually being called up by the user. Do they have access? Is it sensitive? And so on. SIM and threat intelligence to understand kind of the broader ecosystem, compliance aspects we talked about earlier as well. So there's a lot of data sources that can be pulled in, but the important piece here is, kind of again, that separate control plane and data plane, having those PEPs as close to the resources as possible, to really create those granular trust boundaries and prevent any sort of lateral movement and entities accessing anything that they're not supposed to.
And I think, when we talk about a platform and how we align and how, considering the industry best practices and frameworks that are out there, I mean, I wanted to share Trend's own version of how we implemented the model for NIST within Trend Vision One, which is Trend's cybersecurity platform. And it's not something that we built without the guardrails of what the best practices are out there, right? So again, I think aligning yourself to these best practices when considering vendors, where you can have that, the broad, where you can bring all this different telemetry in, plus have the ecosystem integration piece, John, that you mentioned earlier, all of this data coming into one centralized place where you could make those access control decisions, as well as conduct those broad risk assessments dynamically, super important to Zero Trust stance, right? So lean on these best practices to see, to make sure that your implementations are more successful.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great diagram. It really ties back to the NIST framework really well. Identity is one thing you spell out that I overlooked in NIST and didn't call out, but I mentioned that earlier. That's critically important. But I think, again, this ties back to again, what I see and recommend, and what the respondents to the study agreed with towards the bottom is the need for that ecosystem, right? And the ability to bring these components together. Because if you think about, kind of a vendor map, there's a lot of different areas of the cybersecurity stack. We know as an industry, it's been fragmented. And so I think that's, a really strong value proposition with the Vision One platform is really that piece at the bottom, and those partnerships you have on top of the breadth of Vision One itself and the different pillars that we walked through before that it applies to.
Yeah, absolutely. So John, what about proof points for those that are maybe more in the consideration phase? Has your research found early adopters having success with what they're doing?
Yeah, and you made the point earlier about talking to the board and kind of executive stakeholders, and I think this is you know some proof points to pass along that can move the needle in those conversations. The kind of so what. So to start, we asked kind of more qualitatively. Were organizations seeing success across a lot of different areas, both security and business aspects, some related to these in terms of reducing incidents, improving end user performance, and things like that. And there was really strong agreement. 4 out of 5 respondents agreed across all of those areas qualitatively. And then when we kind of drilled down more into the quantitative benefits, there's some really strong metrics here. So reducing security costs on average, $675,000 reduction in costs. That was inclusive, I believe, of both tools and operational costs. So there's often a rationalization when you start looking at tools, and the ability to maybe standardize. And a lot of folks have maybe multiple endpoint or identity products, and kind of collapsing some of those and going with a single vendor or 2 vendors. So there's tool costs savings, and then operational cost savings just from some of the efficiency benefits. Obviously, security is paramount, and so there was a 34% reduction in the number of data breaches that respondents said that their organizations experienced. That's really strong as well. Talked about business benefits, so improved rate of cloud migration. Some of that is just having more confidence as Zero Trust architectures are implemented to be able to move faster. And so again, that was borne out. And then a reduction in mean time to respond, as I think you're kind of putting more guardrails in place. It's a bit easier to narrow down, where threats could have kind of moved from and moved to, and respond more efficiently and effectively. So those are the studies, or the findings, I should say, from our study. I did want to call out that ESG partnered with Trend on a validation of Vision One more broadly, so not necessarily specific to ZeroTrust, but some of the benefits aligned really well with what we found in the market study, in terms of reducing the number of data breaches, and looking at some publicly available information with regards to like Pwnymon and cost of a data breach, and what we identified with Trend customers that we interviewed, potential cost savings through data breaches prevented of around $1.3 million. So again, very much in line with what we found here. Better efficiency with regards to detections and investigations, in terms of alert reduction, reduced time to detect and time to triage. I believe the customers that we interviewed said the number of alerts was reduced from like 1,000 down to 1, so much more, much better efficacy in that regard. And then more efficiency and cost savings in terms of the ability to reduce the number of FTEs and implement cost savings that way, and cool tool consolidation as well, roughly in line with what we saw here. So a lot of connectivity with what we found at the market level with Vision One, more generally. So again, these metrics can all help get some of that buy-in and consensus to be moving forward, by understanding the benefits that early adopters have seen when implementing Zero Trust.
Absolutely. And for our audience, we have shared the link to the ROI calculator, as well as the economic validation value report that ESG had created for us. And so that's in your chat. Feel free to put in your own scenarios to see where you might land in terms of savings, and how you'd implement some of these programs via Vision One. So I encourage you guys to check it out. So we are at the end of our presentation today, and we'd love to see if you guys have any questions. We'll be checking our question and answer tab here to see if you haven't put in any questions yet. We're happy to take questions now. So I'll be checking. Feel free to ask. All right. Mike, are you seeing any questions back there? All right, I think we have one here from Amanda, and I want to ask, Amanda is asking John, how do I talk to my executives about Zero Trust and get them on board? And is there anything that stands out with how to overcome any kind of, objections, any kind of objections?
Yeah, I think we mentioned a couple of those things, towards the end, but I think it starts with, trying to quantify, the challenges that the organization is kind of currently facing. So, current state, I think you have to up-level the discussion a bit. It's pretty easy to get kind of in the weeds, but, understanding as you're talking to a non-technical audience, kind of netting out, the issues you're facing, the potential benefits that you can see, expected, kind of milestones along the way, that the organization can expect to hit, can all help kind of put it in a more digestible format. but it's as I said this before, it's really important to get that buy-in before you start moving forward. Otherwise, you end up seeing the false starts that we referenced earlier.
Thank you, John. Another question here is, you mentioned a lot of different challenges companies see with Zero Trust. Is there anything that stands out with how to overcome them?
Yeah, I mean, again, highlighting, I think, two things if we're almost thinking about this as kind of key takeaways. Obviously, developing that strategy up front. If we think about kind of learning from the leaders, that was, I think, one of the key takeaways. And then also, focusing on technology integration as much as possible, and really the way to do that is through a platform. You know, especially open platforms that boast an ecosystem. Challenges were around complexity, implementation, strategy, and so I think those two things can really alleviate some of the core challenges we see organizations citing.